Hi guys, welcome to Whispered History. American history told slowly and quietly, one story at a time.
Whispered History.
A woman in Philadelphia kept a diary for 49 years, and in the earliest pages, before she ever wrote down anything about tea or taxes or the trouble brewing in the streets, she wrote about candles, how many she dipped that week, how long they burned, whether the tallow had gone rancid in the summer heat. That's what colonial life actually looked like. Not muskets, not speeches, candles and flour and the particular ache in your shoulders after a full day of work that never really ended. Most people picture 1760 as a costume drama. Powdered wigs, candlelit taverns, men arguing about liberty in front of a fireplace. The truth is smaller than that, and stranger. The truth is a 19-year-old girl named Elizabeth Sandwith, sitting at a writing desk in a narrow brick house on Front Street, worrying about whether her butter would spoil before market day. She had no idea her city was 11 years from a war. No idea her own husband would one day be exiled for refusing to take a side. No idea that the ordinary Tuesday she was living through would become, centuries later, one of the last untroubled Tuesdays her generation would get. She just knew the well-needed cleaning, and her sister was sick, and there wasn't enough salt for the winter meat. That's the part nobody tells you about this era. It wasn't lived in headlines, it was lived in inches. An inch of thread rationed carefully across a whole season. An inch of daylight fought for every single morning, because daylight was the only light most families could afford to waste. An inch of trust slowly, quietly cracking between neighbours who'd known each other their whole lives and were about to find out they didn't agree on much of anything. By 1765, 5 years into this story, the streets Elizabeth walked would be filled with effigies burning and crowds shouting outside the homes of men she knew personally. Men who sold stamps for the crown. Men who, a year earlier, had been guests at her family's table. Something was shifting underneath the candle dipping and the butter churning, and almost nobody could feel it happening while it happened. That's usually how the biggest changes in a person's life work, isn't it? Slowly, and then all at once, and you only recognise the turning point when you're already well past it. So here's the real question, the one this story's actually asking. If you were living an ordinary week, right now, with your own small worries about salt and thread, and whether the well needs cleaning, would you have noticed the ground shifting underneath you? Or would it have taken you just as long as it took them? Before we go further into her world, I want to say something simple. This channel exists for people who like their history slow and true, and told the way it actually happened, without the noise. If that's the kind of company you like keeping at night, this is a good place to stay a while. Whispered History tells these stories one at a time, carefully, the way they deserve. You're welcome to stay for this one, and if it settles into you the way I hope it does, there's a small button that lets more of these find their way to you later, quietly, without any fuss. Now, back to Front Street. In the autumn of 1760, colonial Philadelphia was, by the standards of its time, one of the largest cities in the entire British Empire, larger than many towns in England itself, and yet it smelled like a farm. Pigs ran loose in the streets to eat garbage, because the city hadn't yet decided that was a problem worth solving. Chimney smoke sat low over the rooftops most mornings, thick with the particular char of green wood. Because seasoned wood cost money most families didn't have to spare. Water came from a shared well, hauled by hand, and if you wanted it warm, you built the fire yourself, fed it yourself, and watched it yourself. Because an unwatched fire in a wooden city was how entire blocks disappeared in a single night. People didn't measure their day in hours the way we do. They measured it in tasks, the washing task, the baking task, the mending task. Each one took as long as it took, and the sun decided when you were finished, not a clock. This was a world built entirely on hands. Elizabeth's hands, and her mother's hands, and the hands of the enslaved and indentured people who lived and worked inside houses just like hers all across the city, people whose own daily inches of struggle rarely made it into any diary at all. There was no version of 1760 where a household simply ran itself. Every single object in a colonial home, every candle, every loaf, every clean shirt, existed because someone had spent hours of their body making it exist. That's not a footnote to this story. That's the whole story, waiting underneath every prettier version of colonial life you've ever been shown in a painting or a movie. And Elizabeth was about to watch that entire hand-built world collide with something much bigger than herself. A conflict over taxes and tea that would eventually reach directly into her home, her marriage, and her husband's freedom. But in the autumn of 1760, she didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the butter needed churning, and the light was almost gone, and tomorrow, whatever tomorrow held, would start exactly the same way this day had. Quietly, early, and completely unaware of what was coming. What would it take, do you think, to notice the first sign when it finally arrived? The smell hits first. Always does. Tallow smoke, thick and animal, curling from a dozen chimneys at once. Underneath it, the sharper bite of a blacksmith's coal fire 2 streets over, and underneath that, something wetter. Mud, manure, the river at low tide. Front Street in the fall of 1760 didn't smell like a museum. It smelled like a working farm that had somehow grown cobblestones instead of grass. Cartwheels groaned over uneven paving stones. Somewhere a rooster crowed at the wrong hour, confused by the low autumn light, and a woman 2 doors down was shouting at a hog that had wandered into her drying laundry again. This was the sound of an ordinary Tuesday. Not silence. Never silence. A city this size hummed constantly, even before dawn. Inside the Sandwith house the morning started in the dark. Literally. No electric light. No gas lamp. Nothing but a single tallow candle, and whatever grey thread of daylight managed to slip through small, thick-paned windows. Elizabeth would have woken to cold. Real cold. The kind that lived inside the walls all winter and never fully left, because the house had one central hearth trying to heat rooms it was never designed to heat. You'd feel it first in your fingers, stiff and slow, before you even opened your eyes. Getting dressed wasn't quick. Layers of wool and linen, stays laced tight enough to hold your posture through a full day of standing, bending, lifting and carrying. Comfort wasn't really part of the design. Function was. Breakfast, if it happened at all in any form we'd recognise, was usually something simple. Bread from the day before, maybe a little cheese, tea if the household could afford it, and if the tea hadn't become, within a few short years, something far more complicated than a breakfast drink. Then the work began, and it did not stop for hours. Water had to be hauled from the shared well, bucket by bucket, the rope biting into your palms if you weren't careful. Fires had to be built and watched, because in a city built almost entirely of wood, an unwatched flame was how neighbourhoods vanished overnight. Laundry was its own brutal event, not a weekly chore but something closer to a battle. Boiling water over an open flame, lice soap that cracked your skin, wet fabric heavy enough to strain your back, all of it hung to dry and prayed over, because rain could undo a full day's labour in 20 minutes. The market itself was loud, crowded, and completely without refrigeration. Meat hung in open air. Flies were simply accepted as part of commerce. You learned to smell freshness because you had no other way to check it. Coins were scarce. A lot of trade still ran on credit, favours and reputation, meaning your family's good name mattered almost as much as your family's money, sometimes more. Candles were made at home, dipped over and over in melted tallow, the smell settling into your hair and clothes for days afterward. Soap was made at home too, from ashen animal fat, in a process that took the better part of an entire day and filled the house with a smell nobody would call pleasant. Sewing wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Every torn shirt, every worn stocking, every child who'd grown 2 inches since spring meant hours bent over a needle by candlelight, squinting because eyeglasses were expensive and eye strain was simply something you lived with. Entertainment existed, but quietly, reading aloud by the fire, letters carefully written and just as carefully saved, because paper cost money and words carried weight. Church on Sunday wasn't optional. It was the entire structure the week bent itself around, and beneath all of it, always, the specific rhythm of a Quaker household like the Sandwiths, where plainness wasn't poverty, it was principle. Quiet clothing, quiet speech, quiet worship, all deliberately chosen in a city that was, underneath its calm surface, anything but quiet. Because Philadelphia in 1760 was already the largest city in British North America and growing fast. Ships arrived constantly from London, from the Caribbean, from Africa in chains that most residents chose not to look at too closely. New faces, new goods, new rumours from across the ocean about a king deep in debt from a war just finished, looking for new ways to pay for it. None of that had reached Elizabeth. This kitchen yet? Not really. Her world in this particular autumn was still measured in bread and butter and thread, in the ache of her hands after laundry day, in the small satisfaction of a well-dipped candle that burned clean and even. She didn't know yet that the ships bringing tea into her city's harbour would, within a handful of years, become the exact thing that split her world in two. She didn't know that the same king whose debts were quietly discussed by merchants over dinner would soon send men to collect on that debt directly from families like hers. She only knew this particular Tuesday, the cold floor under her feet at dawn, the smoke from a dozen chimneys, the weight of a full water bucket on a rope-burned palm, an entire civilization running almost silently on hands like hers. What do you suppose it would feel like to live an entire life this close to the ground, this close to the fire, this close to your own two hands, and never once suspect how close you are standing to history's edge? A church bell rings somewhere near the harbour, slow and even, the kind of sound that carried for blocks in a city without engines or traffic to compete with it. Most people believe colonial families were, above all else, deeply and rigidly proper. Formal manners, formal marriages, formal distance between husbands and wives, parents and children, all conducted with the stiffness we associate with powdered wigs and portrait paintings. But the truth is messier and warmer than that. Elizabeth Sandwith's own letters and early diary pages, along with the surviving records of dozens of other Philadelphia families from this exact period, describe something closer to genuine partnership and real affection. Husbands who worried openly about their wives' health, young women who chose their own suitors, within reason, rather than accepting whoever their fathers selected. Courtship in Quaker Philadelphia during the 1760s wasn't the cold business deal it's often portrayed as. Meetings for worship doubled as one of the few socially acceptable places young people could actually observe each other, week after week, forming real impressions long before a single word of romance was spoken aloud. There's a particular kind of intimacy in that. Watching someone quietly, patiently, across a room, for months, before either of you says anything at all. Here's the deeper myth, though. the one that matters more. Most people assume colonial Americans thought of themselves as, well, American, as a distinct people, already halfway toward independence, already chafing under a foreign king. That's almost entirely false, and it's worth sitting with how false it is. In 1760, Elizabeth Sandwith and nearly everyone she knew considered themselves British. Proudly, genuinely British. Subjects of the crown, part of the greatest empire the world had ever produced, and grateful for it. When news arrived that fall of King George II's death and the coronation of his young grandson George III, the city didn't erupt in resentment. It erupted in celebration. Bells rang, toasts were raised in taverns, sermons were preached praising the new young king's virtue and promise. This is the part that reshapes everything. The people who would, within 15 years, be shooting at British soldiers on nearby battlefields were, in this exact autumn, drinking to the health of the British crown with real, unforced enthusiasm. There was no secret resentment simmering under the surface yet, no hidden nationalism waiting to erupt. The identity that would eventually call itself American didn't exist yet. Not in any form the people of 1760 would have recognised. What existed instead was something closer to regional pride within a larger British identity. Pennsylvanians were proud of Pennsylvania, the way someone today might be proud of their home state, while still considering themselves fully part of the larger nation surrounding it. The war that had just ended, the one fought largely in these very colonies against France and various native nations allied with different sides, had actually strengthened that British identity rather than weakened it. Colonial militias had fought alongside British regulars. Colonial money had helped fund the effort. Victory felt shared, felt earned together. Nobody in Elizabeth's Philadelphia in the fall of 1760 could have told you what a Boston Tea Party was, because the idea didn't exist yet, not even as a whisper of a thought in anyone's mind. The very same king whose new debts from that just-finished war would eventually push Parliament toward new taxes, taxes that would eventually push colonists toward rebellion, was, in this moment, a source of pride rather than resentment. That's the myth worth breaking. Not that colonial life was harder or stranger than people assume, though it certainly was both. The deeper myth is that the American Revolution was somehow inevitable, sitting quietly on the horizon the entire time waiting for its moment. It wasn't inevitable. Not yet. Not in 1760. It would take specific decisions, made by specific men, over the following handful of years, to slowly turn loyal British subjects like Elizabeth Sandwith into people willing to risk everything against the very crown they'd celebrated that autumn. Historians who've studied Philadelphia's merchant class during this exact period point to something crucial. The relationship between colony and crown in 1760 wasn't a marriage already failing. It was closer to a strong, functioning partnership that hadn't yet been tested. The testing hadn't started, not the Stamp Act, still 5 years away, not the Townshend Acts, not the shots that would eventually ring out at Lexington and Concord, 15 years in an unknowable future. What existed instead was ordinary loyalty, ordinary pride, and an ordinary young woman going about an ordinary week, entirely confident that the world she knew would simply continue. If even the deepest political loyalties of an entire generation could shift this completely within 15 short years, how confident should any of us really be about which of our own loyalties will still make sense 15 years from now? Ink, faint and brown with age, still holds the exact pressure of her hand. Her name was Elizabeth Sandwith. In the autumn of 1760, she was 19 years old, living in her family's home on Front Street in Philadelphia. the second of 5 children born to a merchant family that had done reasonably well for itself without ever becoming truly wealthy. She was not famous. She would never sign a declaration, never lead a protest, never appear in a painting hung in a government building. For most of American history, nobody outside her own family would have known her name at all. But Elizabeth kept a diary. She would keep it, almost without interruption, for the next 49 years, through a revolution, a marriage, 6 children, a husband's exile, and the slow transformation of the very city she was born in. And because she kept it, we know her in a way we know almost no one else from this exact moment in time. She had dark eyes, and by her own later description, a temperament some relatives called too serious for a young woman her age. She read constantly, whenever there was light enough and time enough, which in a working household wasn't often. Her family were Quakers, which shaped nearly everything about how she moved through the world. Plain speech, plain dress, a deep discomfort with anything that smelled of vanity or excess. Quakers of this period also held, at least officially, an early and uncomfortable set of convictions about slavery, convictions the Sandwith household itself did not always fully live up to, in ways Elizabeth's later writings would occasionally wrestle with. Her days had a rhythm as fixed as any factory shift, though nobody would have called it that. Waking before full light, fires to build, water to haul, bread to help bake, in a kitchen thick with wood smoke that stung the eyes every single morning without fail. She had a younger sister, Mary, whom she was close to, close enough that Mary's occasional illnesses appear in Elizabeth's later pages with real visible worry attached to them. Sisters in this era weren't just family. They were co-workers, confidants, and often each other's only real privacy in houses that offered almost none. Elizabeth's world was small in geography. The same handful of streets, the same market, the same meeting house, week after week, and enormous in labour. Every object she touched in a given day, she or someone in her household had likely made by hand. The soap, the candles, much of the cloth, the bread, the very ink she wrote with. There was a particular kind of quiet competence required just to survive an ordinary week, a competence so total and so constant that nobody around her would have thought to call it impressive. It was simply expected. It was simply Tuesday. In the fall of 1760, she was not yet married. Henry Drinker, the man she would eventually spend her life with, was a Quaker merchant a few years older than her, already known in Philadelphia's close-knit trading circles for his careful, deliberate manner. Their courtship, when it came, would move slowly and formally, the way Quaker courtships generally did, built more on observed character than on romantic sweep. She couldn't have known, that particular autumn, that Henry would one day be arrested by the very revolutionary government her fellow Philadelphians would eventually build, exiled to Virginia for 8 months, for refusing on religious grounds to support the war against Britain. She couldn't have known she'd spend those 8 months managing their household and children entirely alone, writing to him constantly, uncertain if or when he'd return. None of that had happened yet. None of that could even be imagined yet. What she had instead, in this exact moment, was a full basket of mending, a sister with a persistent cough that worried her more than she let on, and a market trip planned for the following morning that required careful counting of the household's remaining coin. Money was tight that autumn, not desperately so, but tight enough that Elizabeth had learned, young, the specific discipline of stretching a household's resources across an entire winter without waste. Flour rationed carefully, candles dipped thick enough to burn slow, meat bought only when the price at market made sense, and eaten sparingly enough that it lasted. This wasn't poverty. This was simply how nearly every family in colonial Philadelphia lived, regardless of comfort level, because the entire economy ran on scarcity managed carefully rather than abundance assumed freely. Elizabeth's specific gift, the thing that would eventually make her useful to history in a way she never intended, was attention. She noticed things, small things, the exact date the first frost arrived, the price of butter that particular week compared to the week before, which neighbour's chimney had caught fire and how quickly it was put out. That habit of careful noticing formed in these quiet, unremarkable years would later make her one of the most valuable eyewitnesses historians have to the entire revolutionary period in Philadelphia. Not because she set out to record history, because she simply couldn't stop paying attention to her own ordinary life, day after day, for nearly half a century. But in the fall of 1760, none of that mattered yet. She was simply a young woman with cold hands, a worried heart for her sister's health, and a basket of mending that needed finishing before the light gave out. She had no idea that the young king being celebrated in the streets that season would, within her own lifetime, become the man her future husband would risk everything defying. She had no idea that Front Street itself would one day fill with soldiers, both British and American, marching past the very door she walked through every morning. She only knew this particular evening, the mending in her lap, her sister's cough, quieter now than it had been that morning, which was some small comfort. The candle burning low beside her, its light the only thing standing between her and full darkness. What might it mean, to live so closely inside your own small, careful life, and never once suspect that someone centuries later would come looking for exactly this, your mending, your sister's cough, your worry over coin and candle wax, and call it history? A ship's bell clangs twice against the fog rolling off the Delaware River, and for a moment the whole waterfront seems to hold its breath. Everything so far has been told from inside Elizabeth Sandwith's world. Her hands, her household, her particular Tuesday. But step back a few hundred yards from Front Street down toward the docks, and an entirely different version of 1760 comes into view. Because the same ships bringing Elizabeth's family its sugar, its tea, its fine cloth for special occasions, were part of a trade network that also carried something else. Human beings, sold as property, arriving in chains at ports not far from where Elizabeth did her own family shopping. Pennsylvania, and Quaker Philadelphia specifically, likes to be remembered as the moral exception in colonial America. The colony founded on tolerance, the faith that would eventually lead the movement to abolish slavery decades before most of the country. That reputation isn't entirely false, but in 1760 it wasn't fully true yet either. Quakers in this exact period were only beginning, unevenly and with real internal resistance, to wrestle with the fact that many of their own respected families like the Sandwiths themselves, held enslaved people as household servants and labourers. The formal Quaker stance against slavery wouldn't fully solidify for another decade or more, and even then it would take additional decades before it was consistently enforced within the community itself. So the same city celebrating its reputation for conscience was, at this very moment, a place where enslaved and indentured people performed an enormous share of the invisible labour that made households like Elizabeth's function at all. This is where the story complicates itself in a way no simple narrative can hold comfortably. The hands hauling water at dawn weren't only free hands. The hands boiling laundry, the hands minding younger children, the hands doing the heaviest and least visible household labour across Philadelphia frequently belonged to people with no legal freedom of their own, no diary of their own that survives, no name that made it into any historical record at all. We know Elizabeth's cough-worried sister. We know her mending basket, her careful counting of coin. We know almost nothing, by comparison, about the individuals whose forced labour made her family's particular version of respectable, comfortable colonial life possible. That silence is its own kind of historical evidence. It tells you plainly who was considered worth writing about and who wasn't, by the very people living alongside them every single day. There's a second layer to this perspective shift, one that reaches beyond the walls of any single household. The war that had just ended, the one that left colonists in 1760 celebrating a British victory, hadn't only been fought against France, it had also been fought across and through the ancestral lands of numerous native nations, many of whom had allied with different European powers for reasons entirely their own, reasons that had almost nothing to do with loyalty to any king. For the Lenape people specifically, the very land beneath Philadelphia's cobblestones, the land Elizabeth walked across on her way to market, represented not a settled backdrop for colonial life, but an ongoing, unresolved loss, one that predated her birth and would continue reshaping itself for generations after her death. The peace celebrated in Philadelphia's streets that autumn looked, from a Lenape perspective just a short distance beyond the city's edges, considerably less like peace, and considerably more like the latest chapter in a slow, ongoing displacement. None of this erases Elizabeth Sandwith's own reality. Her cold mornings were genuinely cold. Her labour was genuinely hard. Her worry for her sister was genuinely real, and nothing about acknowledging a wider, harsher context diminishes any of that. But history rarely offers a single vantage point wide enough to hold the entire truth of a moment. What felt, from inside the Sandwith household, like an ordinary season of hard but manageable life, was, from other vantage points just streets or miles away, something considerably more brutal, more precarious, or more actively unjust. This is the complexity most retellings of colonial life simply skip past. The tidy version keeps things simple. Hard-working colonial families, a distant king, a coming revolution. Clean lines, clear heroes. The real 1760 holds all of it at once. Elizabeth's cold hands and real affection for her sister, existing in the very same city, on the very same streets, at the very same hour, as enslaved labour most families simply didn't think to question, and native communities watching a so-called peace unfold in ways that offered them very little peace at all. Recognising all of that doesn't require abandoning Elizabeth's story. It requires holding her story alongside the others that don't survive as clearly, the ones history didn't bother writing down. If the people we remember best from any era are usually the ones who happen to leave a diary behind, what does that tell you about everyone a history simply forgot to ask? A door slams somewhere down the block, hard enough to rattle a window loose in its frame, and for just a second the whole street goes quiet. By the spring of 1763, something had changed in Philadelphia. Small at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Elizabeth was 22 now, still unmarried, though her courtship with Henry Drinker had begun in earnest, careful and slow, the way Quaker courtships were supposed to move. Her days still held the same shape: water, fire, bread, mending. But the talk at market had shifted. The war against France was over now, decisively, with Britain victorious across nearly the entire continent. That should have meant relief. Lower taxes, easier trade, a return to the quiet prosperity everyone assumed peace would bring. It meant the opposite. Britain had won the war, but winning had cost an almost unimaginable amount of money. The Crown's debt had roughly doubled in less than a decade, and someone, eventually, was going to be asked to help pay it down. Word travelled slowly across the ocean in this period, weeks at a time, sometimes longer. But even at that pace, rumours reached Philadelphia by early 1764 that Parliament was considering new measures. Sugar, molasses, import duties tightened in ways that hadn't been enforced quite so strictly before. Merchants like Henry Drinker felt it first, directly, in their ledgers. A shipment delayed. A duty suddenly collected where none had been collected before. A customs official showing up at the docks with new paperwork nobody had seen the previous year. Small changes. Individually, almost forgettable. Together, something else entirely. Elizabeth would have heard about it the way most colonial women heard about political and economic matters, second-hand, over dinner, in the particular tightness of her father's voice, or Henry's, when the conversation turned toward trade. She wasn't reading Parliament's official documents. Almost nobody was. What she was hearing instead was simpler and in some ways more unsettling. Money was getting tighter. Prices were shifting. Men she respected were worried, and they weren't hiding it as well as they usually did. By the fall of 1764, the worry had a name. The Sugar Act, passed that spring, had already begun squeezing colonial merchants harder than expected, cutting into profits on molasses and sugar that whole segments of Philadelphia's economy depended on. And rumours of something larger were spreading. A tax this time, not on goods moving through ports but on paper itself. Newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards and dice, every single one stamped, and every stamp requiring payment directly to the Crown. Nobody knew yet exactly what shape it would take, but the word itself, stamp, had already started appearing in conversations at the Sandwith dinner table, said with a wariness that hadn't existed a year earlier. This is the part almost nobody appreciates about how major historical turning points actually feel while they're happening. There was no single dramatic morning where everything changed. No bell that rang to announce a new era beginning. There was only a slow accumulation of small frictions, a shipment here, a duty there, a conversation at dinner that ran a little longer, a little tenser than it used to. Elizabeth's own life, meanwhile, continued moving at its usual pace, mending, baking, worrying over her sister's health, which had improved but never fully settled into robustness, waiting, with the particular patience required of a young Quaker woman, for Henry's courtship to move toward its formal conclusion. But underneath that steady daily rhythm, something was shifting in the wider world she was part of, whether she'd chosen to notice it fully or not. Merchants across Philadelphia had begun quietly discussing something that would have sounded almost unthinkable a decade earlier. Coordinated resistance, not violence, nothing so extreme, not yet, but organised refusal, a shared decision among traders to simply stop buying certain British goods until Parliament reconsidered. The idea was still new, still tentative, still confined mostly to private conversations among men like Henry, rather than public declarations. But it existed now, where a few years earlier it hadn't existed at all. Elizabeth, writing in her diary that autumn, still filled her pages mostly with household matters, the weather, her sister, a particularly good batch of soap. But even her ordinary entries had begun, almost without her seeming to notice it herself, to include brief mentions of prices rising, of goods harder to find, of a certain tension in her father's voice that hadn't been there before. The stamp tax that everyone feared was still just a rumour in the fall of 1764. It wouldn't become law until the following spring, but rumours, it turns out, can do a certain kind of damage all on their own, long before anything official ever arrives. They can make a comfortable household start counting its coin a little more carefully. They can make a careful young woman start listening a little more closely to conversations she'd normally have let pass over her. Something was coming. Nobody in Philadelphia could have said exactly what, or exactly when, or exactly how bad it might get. They only knew, by the end of that particular autumn, that the easy peace they'd celebrated just a few years earlier had started quietly and unmistakably to feel less certain than it once had. What does it feel like, do you think, to sense a threat forming somewhere just beyond view, long before you have any real way of knowing how large it will eventually grow? Wax seals crack open under a thumbnail, and somewhere inside that small sound sits an entire empire's arithmetic. To understand what was really driving the tension building in Philadelphia by 1764, you have to leave Front Street entirely and look instead at a set of numbers most colonists never saw directly. Britain's war debt, following its victory over France, stood at roughly £130 million, an amount so large that Parliament itself struggled to imagine how it could ever be repaid through ordinary means. Someone was going to have to help cover that debt. And in London, among the men actually making these decisions, a specific logic had taken hold, one that felt entirely reasonable from where they sat, and entirely different from where Elizabeth Sandwith sat. The war, after all, had been fought partly to protect the American colonies from French expansion. Colonial land, colonial trade, colonial safety, all of it secured by British soldiers and British money. So why, the reasoning went, shouldn't the colonies help pay for their own protection? It's a logic that sounds almost fair, stated plainly like that, and that's precisely what made it so dangerous. Reasonable-sounding policies, applied without consultation, without any colonial voice in the actual decision-making, have a way of curdling into resentment far faster than obviously unfair ones do. Because here's what the men in London hadn't fully accounted for. Colonial merchants like Henry Drinker didn't experience these new duties and taxes as a shared sacrifice for a shared victory. They experienced them as decisions made entirely without them, by a government 3,000 miles away, about money that would come directly out of their own ledgers. There's a specific piece of political machinery worth understanding here, because it explains almost everything that followed. Colonial assemblies, like Pennsylvania's own, had no formal representation in Parliament, no seat, no vote, no voice in the room where these taxes were actually being debated and decided. No taxation without representation would eventually become a slogan, chanted in the streets, printed in pamphlets. But in 1764, it wasn't yet a slogan. It was simply a quiet, growing sense among merchants and tradesmen that decisions affecting their entire livelihood were being made by men who had never set foot in Philadelphia, never walked its docks, never once asked what the city actually needed. Meanwhile, in London, there was a genuine and almost total failure of imagination about how any of this would land. Officials assumed colonists would grumble, adjust, and continue on as loyal, profitable subjects the way they always had. They fundamentally misjudged just how tightly colonial prosperity, especially in a trading city like Philadelphia, depended on precisely the kind of flexible, lightly enforced trade practices that new taxes and stricter customs enforcement were now threatening to shut down entirely. For decades, smuggling and loosely enforced trade regulations had quietly kept much of the colonial economy afloat. Everyone knew it happened. Nobody in London had particularly cared, as long as the broader relationship stayed profitable and stable. Now, suddenly, enforcement tightened. Naval ships that had mostly ignored minor trade violations began actively searching vessels. Customs officials who'd once accepted a friendly arrangement began demanding full compliance, sometimes accompanied by soldiers. For a merchant class that had built its entire business model around a certain amount of quiet flexibility, This shift felt less like fair taxation and more like the sudden, unilateral rewriting of rules everyone had been playing by for generations. This is the hidden machinery beneath Elizabeth's tightening household budget and her father's tense dinner table conversations. Not a single villain making a single unfair decision, but an entire system of assumptions on both sides of the ocean, quietly and simultaneously breaking down. London assumed loyalty could absorb almost any policy, as long as it was framed as fair. The colonies assumed a certain baseline of self-governance that had never actually been formally guaranteed, only informally allowed, for so long that it had started to feel like a right rather than a convenience. Neither side in 1764 fully understood how the other one saw the relationship, and that gap in understanding, more than any single tax or duty, was the actual hidden layer driving everything that would follow. Ordinary families like the Sandwiths didn't experience any of this as grand political theory. They experienced it as smaller portions at dinner, as a merchant father whose usual confidence had started to waver, as whispered calculations about which goods might soon cost more and which might simply become impossible to get at all. The distance between London's boardrooms and Philadelphia's kitchens was measured in more than just an ocean. It was measured in two entirely different understandings of what fairness actually required, and nobody on either side of that gap seemed particularly interested yet in closing it through conversation rather than force. How much of what eventually breaks between people, do you think, starts exactly like this? Not with a single unforgivable act, but with two sides quietly assuming they understand each other when they never actually did. Paper tears, sharp and sudden, and for a moment the whole room goes still around the sound of it. By the fall of 1765, the rumour Elizabeth Sandwith had heard whispered at her family's dinner table a year earlier had a name and a date and a physical presence in the city she'd lived in her entire life. The Stamp Act had passed that spring. By November it was set to take effect, requiring an official stamp paid for directly on nearly every piece of paper that mattered. Newspapers, legal contracts, marriage licenses, even the playing cards some families kept for quiet evenings at home. For a merchant family like the Sandwiths, and for Henry Drinker's own growing trade business, this wasn't an abstract political insult. It was a direct tax on the paper their entire livelihood ran on. Elizabeth, now 24, was newly and formally engaged to Henry, their wedding still being planned with the careful, unhurried pace Quaker courtships required, suddenly existed inside a city that felt less stable by the week. On the last day of October, word reached Philadelphia that Philadelphia's own stamp distributor, a man named John Hughes, had been named to enforce the hated tax locally. Hughes wasn't a stranger to the Sandwiths world. He was a known figure, respected in some circles, a fellow Philadelphian who now found himself, almost overnight, treated as the local face of an entire empire's overreach. Crowds gathered outside his home, not a mob in the sense of chaos and random violence, not yet, but something colder and more organised. A deliberate, coordinated show of collective refusal meant to make clear exactly how unwelcome the stamps would be. Elizabeth would have heard the shouting from blocks away. Sound carried easily through a city built this close together, this quiet in ordinary times. Henry, deeply involved in Philadelphia's merchant community, faced his own version of an impossible choice. Quakers held firm religious convictions against public violence and disorder, but Quaker merchants also depended entirely on trade now being strangled by exactly the policy the crowds outside Hughes's house were protesting. There was no comfortable position to hold. Support the protests and risk violating deeply held religious principles about peace and order. Stay silent and risk being seen as complicit in a tax that was actively destroying colonial commerce. Most Quaker merchants, Henry likely among them, chose something quieter but no less meaningful. Economic resistance rather than street protest. A growing informal agreement among Philadelphia's traders to simply stop importing certain British goods until the act was repealed. This is where the real courage of this particular moment actually lived, and it rarely looked dramatic from the outside. It looked like a merchant turning away profitable shipments he desperately needed. It looked like a household like the Sandwiths quietly doing without certain imported goods, tea among them, not because they'd run out, but because using them now carried a different weight than it had a year earlier. Elizabeth's own diary entries from this period, sparse and practical as ever, begin recording small, specific sacrifices. Homespun cloth chosen over finer imported fabric. Local alternatives sought for goods that had always simply come from London. None of this made headlines. None of it involved muskets or blood. But it required a specific, sustained kind of resolve, the kind that has to be renewed every single day, in dozens of small decisions, rather than proven once in a single dramatic moment. By early November, the pressure on John Hughes had become unbearable. Crowds surrounded his home again, larger this time and more insistent. He was pressured, directly and forcefully, to publicly resign his position as stamp distributor. He held out for a while. Then, faced with a crowd that showed no sign of dispersing and genuine fear for his own safety, he finally agreed. Philadelphia, without a single shot fired, had made its own local stamp tax functionally unenforceable. Elizabeth would have felt the relief that rippled through the merchant community in the days that followed, even if she recorded it in her usual understated way. A crisis, at least locally, had been averted, not through violence, but through a stubborn collective refusal that had held firm long enough to work. But relief, in this particular moment, came with a new and unfamiliar undercurrent. The city that had celebrated its British king so warmly just 5 years earlier had just successfully forced one of the Crown's own policies into retreat. That wasn't loyalty anymore, not in its old, uncomplicated form. It was something new, something Elizabeth and everyone around her were still learning the shape of. Henry's own quiet economic resistance, multiplied across dozens of merchants just like him, had proven something none of them had fully expected going in. Ordinary people choosing ordinary sacrifices consistently could actually move an empire, even just slightly, even just locally. It wouldn't be the last time that lesson got tested, not by a long distance. But for one particular autumn, in one particular city, a young engaged couple, a household doing without its usual tea, and a merchant community united by nothing louder than stubborn refusal, had shown something worth remembering. What does it actually take, do you think, to hold a quiet line like that? Not for one dramatic afternoon, but for months, when giving in would have been so much easier. A grocery store shelf sits half empty, and nobody working there can quite explain why, only that the truck simply didn't come this week. That image would have made perfect sense to Elizabeth Sandwith. It would have made almost no sense at all to most Americans until fairly recently. In the winter of 2021 and well into 2022, ordinary Americans experienced something their grandparents' generation had mostly never known firsthand. Shortages. Not from war, not from famine, but from a supply chain suddenly, unexpectedly fragile. Cars sat unfinished on factory lots, missing a single computer chip manufactured on the other side of the world. Furniture orders stretched from weeks into months. Baby formula, of all things, became genuinely difficult to find in parts of the country, for reasons most families had no direct way of understanding or controlling. For a brief but disorienting stretch, Americans got a small modern taste of something colonial households like the Sandwiths lived with constantly. The unsettling realization that your daily life depends entirely on a vast, distant system you have no real influence over, and that system can fail or simply falter without warning. Elizabeth's household didn't lose access to tea because the crop failed. They chose to do without it, deliberately, as an act of collective economic resistance. But underneath that choice sat the same fragile truth that resurfaced so visibly in 2021. An economy built on long, complicated chains of dependency is only ever as stable as its weakest, most distant link. Here's where the comparison sharpens into something more specific and more uncomfortable. During the height of the supply shortages, some American consumers, frustrated and searching for someone to blame, began deliberately avoiding certain products, certain countries of origin, certain companies perceived as having worsened the crisis. A modern, scattered, largely disorganized echo of what Philadelphia's merchants did with real discipline in 1765. The difference is instructive. Philadelphia's boycott worked because it was coordinated, sustained, and collectively enforced across an entire merchant community, acting with shared purpose. It wasn't individual consumers making isolated choices in isolation. It was an organized economic bloc, applying pressure with real, unified intention over months until the pressure produced results. Modern America, by contrast, struggled during its own supply crisis to organize anything close to that kind of sustained, collective response. Individual frustration was everywhere. Coordinated, effective pressure was much harder to find. That's not a flaw unique to the present moment. It might simply be what happens when a population grows large enough and distant enough from its own economic choices that pulling together around anything specific becomes genuinely difficult. There's something else worth sitting with here, something closer to the emotional core of what Elizabeth's household actually experienced. The tea shortage in Sandwith's home wasn't really about tea. It was about a family choosing deliberately to feel a small daily inconvenience as a form of solidarity with people they'd likely never meet. Merchants and dock workers and fellow colonists across a dozen other cities, all making the exact same quiet sacrifice at the exact same time. That's a specific kind of discipline modern life rarely asks of anyone anymore. Most Americans today can, with enough money, simply root around almost any shortage or inconvenience, pay more, order from somewhere else, wait a little longer for a substitute that arrives eventually anyway. Elizabeth's generation didn't have that option nearly as often. When tea was gone, tea was simply gone, until the political situation that caused its absence actually changed. There's a strange kind of privilege visible in that difference, one worth genuinely sitting with rather than glossing past. The ability to opt out of collective hardship entirely, simply by having enough resources to buy your way around it, wasn't really available to most people in Elizabeth's Philadelphia. Everyone, more or less, felt the tea shortage together. Rich and poor alike, at least within the merchant class, experienced the same absence, the same daily reminder that something larger than their own household was at stake. Modern supply shortages rarely land that evenly. Wealthier households root around scarcity far more easily than poorer ones do, meaning the same crisis lands as a minor inconvenience for some and something considerably harder for others. That unevenness would have struck Elizabeth as strange, maybe even troubling, coming from a community that had just spent months proving how much collective sacrifice, shared equally, could actually accomplish. Perhaps that's the sharpest edge of this particular mirror. Not simply that scarcity happened then and happens again now in different forms, but that the earlier version required something modern. Scarcity rarely manages to produce any more. A shared sense that everyone was giving something up, together, for the same reason, at the same time. What would it take, do you think, for that kind of shared, deliberate sacrifice to feel possible again? not forced by circumstance, but chosen together on purpose. A gavel taps once, twice, and the argument in the room doesn't stop. It just gets quieter, sharper, more dangerous. Historians studying Philadelphia's response to the Stamp Act crisis generally agree on the basic sequence of events. They disagree, often sharply, on what that sequence actually reveals about the people living through it. The first real question centres on Quaker involvement itself, and it's more contested than most popular retellings suggest. Some historians argue that Quaker merchants like Henry Drinker deserve real credit for finding a principled middle path, refusing violence, refusing public disorder, while still applying genuine, effective economic pressure through boycott and non-importation. In this reading, the Quaker response represents a kind of moral sophistication, proof that meaningful resistance didn't require abandoning core religious convictions about peace. Other historians push back hard against that framing. They point out that Quaker non-participation in the street protests outside John Hughes's home wasn't purely principled. It was also, at least partly, self-interested caution. Public unrest threatened property and business stability just as much as the tax itself did. Staying above the crowd wasn't only about religious conviction. It was also, this argument goes, a convenient way to benefit from the crowd's pressure while avoiding any of its risk or its costs. Both readings can be true at once, and that's precisely what makes this such a genuinely unresolved question, rather than a simple one with an obvious answer. There's a second, deeper debate underneath the first one, and it reaches directly into how Elizabeth Sandwith's own household should be understood. Some historians treat merchant families like the Sandwiths and Drinkers as quiet heroes of early colonial resistance, ordinary people making real sacrifices, tea among them, for a cause that would eventually reshape an entire nation. Others push back firmly against that heroic framing. They argue it retroactively assigns revolutionary meaning to choices that, at the time, were far more modest and far less certain. In 1765, nobody in Philadelphia was fighting for American independence. They were fighting, more narrowly and more practically, for better treatment within the British Empire, as loyal subjects who felt genuinely wronged, not as future revolutionaries already imagining a separate nation. Reading these merchants as early patriots, this argument suggests, flattens a much messier, more ambiguous reality into a tidier story than the evidence actually supports. There's real weight on both sides of that disagreement. Elizabeth's own diary entries from this exact period contain no hint of revolutionary sentiment, no early yearning for independence. What they contain instead is worry, practical worry, about prices, about a fiancé's business, about a political relationship that had started to feel unpredictable in ways it hadn't before. Whether that worry constitutes an early form of resistance worth celebrating, or simply reflects ordinary people reacting to ordinary economic pressure without any larger political meaning attached, remains genuinely, actively debated among historians who've spent entire careers studying this exact period. A third layer of disagreement concerns the boycott's actual effectiveness, and this one gets surprisingly technical. Some economic historians argue the non-importation agreement succeeded primarily through their symbolic and organisational power, proving colonial unity was possible, rather than through the direct economic damage they inflicted on British trade, which some analyses suggest was more modest than colonial leaders claimed at the time. Others maintain the economic pressure was real and substantial, pointing to specific drops in British exports to the colonies during this period as clear evidence the boycotts genuinely hurt. British merchants badly enough to influence Parliament's eventual decision to repeal the Act the following year, untangling exactly how much of the Stamp Act's repeal came from economic pressure, how much came from British merchants lobbying their own Parliament out of self-interest, and how much came from simple political embarrassment, remains a genuinely open question, one without a clean, settled answer even now. What almost everyone studying this period does agree on is something quieter, and perhaps more important than any of these specific disputes. Something shifted in how colonists like Elizabeth understood their own collective power during this exact crisis. Whether or not any individual household fully recognised that shift while it was happening, whether that shift should be read as the true beginning of a revolutionary consciousness, or simply as one ordinary community successfully defending its own narrow economic interests, without any larger meaning intended or understood, is a question historians continue arguing about, often quite fiercely at conferences and in journals to this day. Elizabeth herself, writing quietly by candlelight that particular autumn, almost certainly never imagined her small household's choice to go without tea would still be debated by scholars nearly 3 centuries later. Which version of this story do you find yourself believing more? Ordinary people quietly becoming revolutionaries without knowing it yet, or ordinary people simply protecting their own interests in a story history later decided to make bigger than it actually was? A printing press clatters back to life, sheet after sheet, and the sound alone tells you something has changed. By March of 1766, word finally reached Philadelphia across the Atlantic. Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act. Bells rang again, the same bells that had rung 5 years earlier for a young king's coronation, only this time the celebration carried a different weight entirely. Relief, yes. But underneath the relief, something else. A quiet, unmistakable confirmation that collective resistance had actually worked. Elizabeth, 25 years old now, and newly married to Henry Drinker that same year, would have felt that relief personally and immediately. Tea could return to the household table. Trade could resume its normal rhythm. The wedding she'd waited through years of tension to finally celebrate had arrived in a city that, for the moment, felt like it was exhaling. But repeal came with a hidden condition. Almost nobody in Philadelphia fully registered at the time, one buried inside a companion piece of legislation called the Declaratory Act. That act stated plainly that Parliament retained full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Britain hadn't backed down from the underlying principle at all. It had simply withdrawn one specific unpopular tax, while quietly reasserting its right to try something similar again whenever it chose. Most Philadelphians celebrating in the streets that spring didn't dwell on that clause. Why would they? The immediate crisis had passed. Tea was flowing again. Henry's business could breathe. But the pattern the Stamp Act crisis had revealed didn't disappear along with the tax itself. It had simply been tested, refined, and proven to work. Within 2 years, Parliament tried again. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new duties, this time on glass, paint, paper, and tea itself, the very good Elizabeth's household had so deliberately done without just a few years earlier. And this time, Philadelphia's merchants didn't need to invent their resistance strategy from scratch. The playbook already existed. Non-importation agreements, organised boycotts, coordinated economic pressure. What had been improvised in 1765 became institutional practice by the end of the decade. Elizabeth's own household, now managing her and Henry's growing family and business together, lived through this second boycott with the practiced discipline of people who'd already done it once before. They knew this time roughly what to expect. They knew too how effective sustained collective sacrifice could actually be. This is where the long-term consequences of that one autumn in 1765 become visible in a way nobody living through it could have fully appreciated yet. The Stamp Act crisis had created something that hadn't existed before at any meaningful scale. Colonial newspapers up and down the coast, from Boston to Charleston, had covered Philadelphia's resistance, and Boston's, and New York's, creating for the first time a genuine shared sense of colonial identity, that stretched well beyond any single city's own local interests. Committees of correspondence, formal networks allowing colonies to coordinate resistance efforts and share information quickly, grew directly out of the organisational habits merchants had built during the Stamp Act crisis. What began as Philadelphia traders informally comparing notes with counterparts in other port cities gradually formalised into structures that, within a decade, would prove essential to coordinating actual revolutionary action. The economic muscle memory mattered just as much as the political networks. By the time the Tea Act triggered the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and Parliament responded with the coercive acts the following year, colonial merchants across multiple cities knew exactly how to organise a coordinated, effective boycott within weeks, because they'd already done it twice before. Henry Drinker's own business would eventually be caught directly in this escalating cycle. His Quaker convictions against violence, tested first quietly during the Stamp Act crisis, would be tested far more severely a decade later, when refusing to actively support the revolution against the very crown his younger self had once celebrated, would result in his arrest and 8-month exile to Virginia in 1777. Elizabeth would manage their household and children entirely alone through those 8 months, drawing on exactly the kind of quiet, sustained discipline her family had first practiced years earlier, going without tea, running a household through absence and uncertainty, waiting for a crisis to finally resolve itself. The structural legislation matters here too. The Stamp Act crisis pushed colonial assemblies toward their first real experiments in intercolonial cooperation, most visibly through the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 itself, where representatives from 9 colonies met together for the first time to formally protest a shared grievance with a single, unified voice. That Congress had no formal legal authority. It couldn't overturn a single law, but it established a precedent, a working model for exactly the kind of coordinated colonial action that would, a decade later, produce the Continental Congress itself. None of this was visible to Elizabeth in the spring of 1766, celebrating repeal and her own recent marriage in a city that felt, for the moment, like it had successfully weathered its storm. What she couldn't have known was that the storm hadn't actually passed. It had simply been postponed, its underlying causes left fully intact, waiting to resurface in a slightly different form within a matter of years. If a crisis gets resolved without its actual root cause ever being addressed, how long, do you think, before that exact same crisis finds its way back to your door, wearing a different name? A trunk lid closes with a heavy, final thud, and somewhere inside it sits everything a family decides it can't leave behind. By 1777, more than a decade past that first autumn of rumour and rising tension, Elizabeth Drinker was 36 years old, the mother of several children, and the head of a household suddenly, violently reorganised around an absence. Henry had been arrested that fall, along with several other prominent Quaker men, accused of loyalist sympathies for refusing on religious grounds to swear an oath of allegiance to the new revolutionary government or take up arms against the crown. He was exiled to Virginia without trial, without a clear end date, without any real certainty he'd return at all. The city Elizabeth had grown up in, the one that had once celebrated a young king's coronation with genuine, unforced joy, was now occupied by British troops actively fighting against the very revolutionary government that had exiled her husband for refusing to support it. Elizabeth found herself standing, quite literally, between both sides of a war neither she nor Henry had ever fully chosen. Too loyalist for the revolutionaries, too uncertain in British eyes to be trusted either. A woman managing a household of children essentially alone in a city under military occupation, while her husband sat in exile for a set of convictions he'd never abandoned, and she'd never asked him to. This is where the discipline built a decade earlier, during that first quiet Stamp Act boycott, revealed its true, lasting value. Elizabeth ran the household's finances, negotiated directly with British officers who occupied parts of the city and occasionally her own neighbourhood for protection and fair treatment. Wrote to Henry constantly, letters carried by whatever unreliable, dangerous means were available during active war, never certain if a given letter would even reach him. She managed Henry's business affairs as best she could from a distance, protecting what remained of a trade network that had spent years building relationships now scattered and strained across an active battlefield. She did this while also managing the ordinary, unglamorous work of feeding and raising children during a period of genuine, sustained scarcity, worse in many ways than anything her own girlhood household had experienced. The woman who had once carefully rationed tea as an act of political solidarity was now rationing considerably more out of stark, immediate necessity, with no guarantee her husband would ever walk back through their own front door. Henry was finally released in the spring of 1778, after roughly 8 months of exile, his health noticeably worn by the experience but his convictions remarkably entirely intact. Their reunion, described only briefly and with characteristic Quaker restraint in Elizabeth's own diary, nonetheless carries enormous weight precisely because of that restraint. A woman who'd spent nearly a year managing an impossible situation largely alone didn't need dramatic language to convey what her husband's return actually meant to her. The Philadelphia Elizabeth and Henry rebuilt their life in, after 1778 looked nothing like the city of her girlhood. It was by then a city that had chosen a side, fought a war, and begun the slow, uncertain work of becoming something entirely new. Not a British colony anymore, not yet fully sure what it actually was instead. Quakers like the Drinkers occupied an unusually complicated position in this transformed city. Their pacifist convictions had made them suspect revolutionaries throughout the war, but those same convictions, combined with genuine, sustained community service during and after the conflict, gradually rebuilt a measure of trust and respect within the broader community over the following years. Elizabeth herself changed considerably across these 2 decades, though the change happened so gradually within her own pages that it's only visible looking backward across the full span of her diary, rather than in any single dramatic entry. The careful young woman worrying over her sister's cough and the household's coin had become a woman who'd managed a family through military occupation, negotiated directly with enemy officers, and kept an entire household's ordinary rhythms functioning through genuine, sustained crisis. That transformation mirrors something larger happening across the entire city, and eventually the entire nation during this exact period. Ordinary people who'd spent their whole lives assuming a certain stable order would simply continue indefinitely, discovered they were capable of considerably more resilience, more improvisation, and more sustained sacrifice than they'd ever had reason to test before 1765. America's own identity underwent a nearly identical transformation across these same years. A collection of British colonies, proudly loyal and largely unified in that loyalty as recently as 1760, had become, by the early 1780s, something genuinely new, uncertain of its exact shape, uncertain of how its various parts would hold together, but unmistakably no longer simply British. Elizabeth would live long enough to watch that new nation take further shape around her, through a constitution, through a first president, through decades of change she recorded faithfully in the same careful, observant hand she'd used as a 19-year-old girl worrying over butter and thread. She never stopped being, in some essential way, exactly who she'd always been: careful, observant, quietly resilient. What changed was simply the scale of what that quiet resilience was eventually asked to hold, if an entire identity, personal or national, can transform this completely across just 20 years, without anyone fully noticing the exact moment the old version disappeared, what does that suggest about the identity you're currently living inside right now, without realizing it's already changing too? A teacup sits untouched on a saucer, cooling slowly, and there's something almost defiant in how long it's allowed to sit there. There's a specific insight buried inside Elizabeth Drinker's story, one that doesn't announce itself the way a grand historical lesson usually does. It hides instead inside something almost embarrassingly small, a choice about tea repeated day after day for months. Most retellings of this era reach for a bigger lesson than that: unity, courage, the birth of a nation. Those lessons aren't wrong exactly. They're just too large to actually hold on to, too far removed from anything an ordinary person could use on an ordinary Tuesday of their own. The smaller lesson, the one Elizabeth's own life quietly demonstrates, is this: restraint, practiced consistently in private without applause, is its own distinct form of strength, separate entirely from the louder, more visible kind. Nobody wrote songs about a household choosing homespun cloth over imported fabric. No crowd gathered outside the Sandwith home to cheer them on for going without tea. That particular sacrifice happened quietly, at a kitchen table, repeated privately, meal after meal with no audience at all. And yet it worked. Not alone, not by itself, but as one thread in a much larger fabric of thousands of households, making the exact same quiet choice, day after day, until an empire 3,000 miles away finally noticed the cumulative weight of it. Here's what strikes me most about that pattern. We tend to measure historical courage by its visibility. The crowd outside John Hughes's house, the dramatic confrontation, the moment that makes it into a painting or a headline. But Elizabeth's diary suggests something else entirely mattered just as much, maybe more. The unglamorous, unwitnessed consistency of choosing the harder option privately again and again, long after the initial outrage that sparked the choice had faded into ordinary routine. That's a genuinely different kind of discipline than the one usually celebrated in history. It doesn't require a single moment of bravery. It requires something arguably harder. Showing up the same way, quietly, on the 100th ordinary day, exactly as you did on the first dramatic one. There's a second layer to this wisdom, one specific to Elizabeth's own particular circumstances rather than something generic enough to apply to any historical figure at all. Elizabeth never chose the crisis that would eventually define large stretches of her adult life. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, her husband's arrest and exile, none of it was her decision. All of it arrived from outside, imposed by forces operating at a scale far beyond her own household. What she did control, consistently, across decades, was how she responded to circumstances she never chose. Careful management, sustained attention, a refusal to let crisis become chaos inside her own home, even when chaos was quite literally occupying the streets outside her front door. That distinction matters enormously, and it's easy to miss if you're only looking for grand, sweeping lessons about revolution and independence. Elizabeth's real skill wasn't political conviction, though she certainly held real convictions. Her real skill was the specific, practiced ability to keep something small and steady functioning, competently and consistently, directly inside the middle of forces enormously larger than herself. A household fed, a ledger balanced, children raised, a husband's business protected from a distance, through letters carried across an active war zone, with no guarantee any single letter would even arrive. None of that required her to control the war, or the tax policy, or the eventual outcome of any of it. It only required her to control her own response day after day, whether that day was calm or genuinely terrifying. This is where the wisdom becomes something usable rather than merely admirable. Most of us will never face a stamp tax, or a husband's political exile, or a city under military occupation. But nearly everyone eventually faces some version of Elizabeth's basic situation. Circumstances imposed from outside, entirely beyond personal control, arriving whether you're ready or not. What her diary demonstrates, quietly, and without ever meaning to teach anyone anything, is that the actual battleground in moments like that isn't usually the large dramatic event itself. It's the accumulation of smaller decisions made in its shadow, whether to keep the household running with care or let it slide into disorder, whether to keep writing honest letters even when there's no certainty they'll be read, whether to keep choosing the harder, quieter discipline long after anyone would notice or reward it. Elizabeth Drinker never set out to prove any of this. She simply lived it, one ordinary day at a time, across nearly 50 years of careful, consistent pages. The choice to go without tea in 1765 and the choice to hold a household together alone in 1777 weren't really two separate stories. They were the exact same discipline, tested at two very different scales, more than a decade apart. That's the wisdom worth carrying forward from this particular story specifically. Not that community matters, though it does. Not that nobody survives alone, though that's true too. Something narrower and more personally useful than either of those. The quiet, private, unwitnessed choices you make consistently, especially the ones nobody's watching and nobody will ever applaud, are usually the exact ones that determine whether you hold steady when the larger, louder crisis finally does arrive at your own front door. What quiet discipline are you already practicing right now in some small corner of your own ordinary life that you won't fully understand the value of until years from now, when it's finally, unexpectedly tested? A church bell tolls at dusk, slow and unhurried, the same sound that once announced a coronation now simply marking the ordinary end of an ordinary day. There's a particular kind of American identity that formed, almost invisibly, across the exact years this story has followed. Not in a single declaration, not in a single battle, but in thousands of households like Elizabeth Drinker's, quietly redefining what loyalty, sacrifice and belonging actually meant to them. One small decision at a time. It's worth sitting for a moment with what that identity wasn't. It wasn't born fully formed in 1760, waiting patiently for its moment to emerge. The Philadelphia that celebrated a young British king with real, unforced joy had no template yet for what it would eventually become. No shared story, no shared name for the thing it was slowly turning into. What existed instead was something built almost entirely through accumulated experience. Shared inconvenience during a boycott, shared uncertainty during a war, shared grief and shared relief, distributed unevenly across a population that didn't always agree with each other, but had, without quite meaning to, started living through the same specific history together. Elizabeth's own family occupied a particularly uncomfortable position inside that emerging identity. Quaker convictions placed them outside the more common revolutionary narrative, the one built around soldiers and battles and dramatic declarations of independence. Henry's exile made that discomfort painfully literal. A man punished by his own community's new government for holding firm to principles that community had, in earlier years, respected rather than punished. And yet the Drinkers were never truly outside this story. They were living directly inside its most difficult, least celebrated contradictions. What does loyalty mean when the thing you're loyal to keeps changing shape underneath you? What does it mean to belong to a community whose direction you can't fully support and still choose, deliberately, to remain inside it rather than leave? Those questions didn't resolve neatly for Elizabeth, and they haven't resolved neatly for the country that grew out of her exact historical moment either. American identity, from its very earliest years, was never actually built on full agreement. It was built on people who disagreed, sometimes profoundly, choosing to remain bound together anyway, inside the same uncertain, unfinished project. That's worth remembering directly, honestly, as an American reading this now. The comforting version of this history imagines a unified population marching confidently toward independence, certain of their cause from the very beginning. The real version looks much more like Elizabeth's household, uncertain, divided even within families over exactly how far resistance should go, bound together less by agreement than by the simple, undeniable fact of having lived through the same specific years in the same specific place together. There's something quietly reassuring in that, if you let it settle. The idea that a shared identity doesn't actually require everyone to feel the same way about everything. It only requires people willing to keep showing up inside the same shared story, even during the exact stretches when that story feels genuinely uncertain, or painful, or hard to fully believe in. Elizabeth kept writing her diary through every single one of those uncertain years, through boycott and reunion, through occupation and exile, through a marriage that survived circumstances neither she nor Henry had any control over. She never stopped documenting her own small corner of a much larger transformation, even during the years that transformation asked the most of her. That persistence is its own quiet form of belonging, not agreement, not certainty, just the sustained decision to keep participating, keep recording, keep showing up as part of something larger than any single household, even when that larger thing felt fragile or divided or genuinely uncertain of its own future. You are, in a very real sense, still living inside the same unfinished project Elizabeth's generation began. The specific arguments have changed. The specific crises look different now than a stamp tax or an occupied city. But the underlying question hasn't actually changed at all. What do you owe a shared community during the exact stretches when that community feels most uncertain of itself? Elizabeth's answer, lived out quietly across nearly 50 years of careful pages, wasn't grand or dramatic. It was steady. Show up. Do the difficult, unglamorous work directly in front of you. Stay bound to the people and place you belong to, even through the years when belonging cost you something real. That answer still holds, all these centuries later, for anyone willing to look closely enough at what her ordinary life actually demonstrated. What does belonging to something larger than yourself actually require of you, right now, during whatever uncertain stretch your own particular moment happens to be living through? A diary closes for the last time, its final page dated decades after the first, the ink noticeably shakier than it once was, but still, unmistakably, hers. Elizabeth Drinker died in Philadelphia in 1807, 47 years after that particular autumn, when she was 19 years old, worrying over her sister's cough and a household's careful count of coin. She'd lived to see a war end, a nation form, a constitution written, and a 19th century begin. All of it recorded in the same patient, observant hand she'd used as a girl who had no idea any of it was coming. She never knew her diary would survive, never knew it would eventually become one of the most valuable eyewitness records historians have of an entire American generation living through its own transformation. She simply kept writing day after day, because that was the discipline she had built, long before she had any reason to believe anyone would ever read it back. Here's what her life actually leaves behind once you set aside the dates and the politics and the names of acts passed by a distant parliament. A record of exactly how slowly the largest changes in a life or a nation actually arrive. Not as a single dramatic morning, but as 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last, until enough of them had passed that the world underneath her feet had quietly become somewhere else entirely. Consider how much had to happen, in pieces too small to notice individually, before that transformation was complete. A rumour about a stamp whispered at a dinner table, a crowd outside a stamp distributor's home, cold and determined, a household choosing homespun cloth over imported fabric for months without applause, a husband's arrest, a wife's solitary management of a family through military occupation, a reunion described in only a few careful, restrained sentences, because that was simply how Elizabeth wrote, even about the things that must have shaken her most. None of those moments, taken alone, look like history. They look like exactly what they were. Difficult days, endured one at a time, by people who had no way of knowing which of their ordinary choices would eventually matter, and which would simply disappear, the way most ordinary choices do. That pattern hasn't stopped. It's simply wearing different clothes now. Somewhere in America tonight, a household is making its own version of Elizabeth's quiet, unwitnessed choice. Not about tea, and not about a stamp tax. Something smaller, something specific to this exact decade, that won't be recognised as historically significant by anyone living through it, including the person making the choice. Maybe it's a decision about where to spend, or where not to. Maybe it's a choice to keep showing up for a community that feels genuinely uncertain of its own direction, the way Philadelphia felt uncertain in 1765, and again in 1777. Maybe it's simply the discipline of documenting an ordinary life carefully enough that someone, decades from now, might actually understand what it was like to live through this exact moment, rather than only what the headlines eventually said about it. That's the part worth carrying out of this story and into whatever comes next. History rarely announces itself while it's happening. It arrives disguised as an ordinary evening, an ordinary decision, an ordinary household simply trying to get through another unremarkable week. Elizabeth never set out to become a witness to a revolution. She set out to keep her family fed, her ledger honest, her sister's cough monitored, her husband's letters answered, one difficult day following another, for nearly 50 years. The revolution happened around those ordinary tasks, not instead of them. It was woven directly into the fabric of her most unremarkable hours, indistinguishable at the time from everything else she was already carrying. Maybe that's the truest thing this particular story can offer. The next great turning point, whatever shape it eventually takes, won't announce itself clearly enough for anyone to recognise it in the moment either. It will arrive the way Elizabeth's did, quietly, gradually, disguised as nothing more than another difficult, ordinary season to get through, one indistinguishable Tuesday at a time, until it isn't ordinary anymore, and by then, it never was. Front Street still exists in Philadelphia today, though almost nothing about it would look familiar to Elizabeth now. The well is gone. The candle smoke is gone. The particular cold that lived inside those thin colonial walls every winter morning is gone too, replaced by heat that arrives at the flip of a switch without a single hour of anyone's labour required to produce it. But somewhere underneath that transformed street, in whatever records survive of a life carefully, faithfully documented for nearly 50 years, a 19-year-old girl is still there, still worried about her sister, still counting the household's coin by candlelight, still entirely unaware that the ordinary Tuesday she's living through will one day be studied centuries later for exactly what it was. Not a historic moment, just a life, lived carefully, one unremarkable day at a time, by someone who never once thought to call it anything more than that. And somewhere tonight, in a house you've never seen, on a street that doesn't yet know its own name in history, someone else is doing the exact same thing. Counting what little they have, making a quiet choice nobody will notice, closing a door, blowing out a light, trusting that tomorrow will start the same ordinary way today did. They have no idea, of course. None of us ever do. The candle gutters low on the sill, and somewhere just beyond the window, Front Street settles into its final, unremarkable dark. Elizabeth Drinker never knew her quiet Philadelphia diary would outlive an empire. That's the kind of ordinary history whispered history exists to tell, slowly, carefully, one forgotten life at a time. If tonight's story stayed with you, rest easy. There's another quiet corner of the past waiting for you tomorrow.